study of the Constitution and civic responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is the 17th day of August in the year 2015, and we welcome you to another week of programming here at the Virtual Center. Again, the 17th of August, we have gone beyond the midpoint of yet another month, and most people now are looking at the tail end of summer, so to speak, and commenting about it. Most of the schools in our area are already underway. Many of the colleges and universities are beginning this week as well. I think once that happens and once the dust settles, I think everybody agrees we're beyond summer and into fall. Of course, there remains the traditional idea of Labor Day being the cutoff point between one season and the other, and it's traditionally been viewed that way. But be that as it may, we've pretty much made it through the summer, I think, the heat of the summer, and now I guess we can think about what kind of a winter we might have. It is a pleasure to be with you once again for another week of programming here at the Virtual Center. I appreciate your willingness to stay in here with us and to continue to support this program, to support the Head On Radio Network. And I know that Bob Kincaid has a campaign underway to purchase some new equipment, which would, in reality, expand the potential of the audience and all of that for his program and for the network. And I totally support that effort. And I want to thank all of you who have already stepped up and made some sort of an effort to support Bob in this campaign. Again, anything that you can do, any way that you might encourage more people to listen and to support, and I don't mean just listen once, because I don't think you can do that and get the full flavor. I think you basically have to give it a chance, if you will, to kind of sink in, and then you begin to appreciate how different it is over what you traditionally hear on conversation radio or talk radio, traditional terrestrial talk radio. Anyway, thank you so very much. It is a pleasure to be with you for yet another week. And I want to once again extend an invitation for those of you who are so inclined to pick up the phone and give us a call and participate actively in our program by giving other listeners the opportunity to hear your ideas, your thoughts, your concerns, your suggestions, and again, recognizing that if you have thoughts or ideas or concerns, undoubtedly they are or would be of interest to other folks as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, with your ideas or suggestions or concerns or whatever, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906, all one word, @gmail.com. And again, I remind you that we do have a Facebook page. If you go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will gain access to our page. I received, checking the page out this morning, I'm looking for comments that people might make, and I've gotten a number. And I was noticing that here within the last week I have made 3 postings on the Virtual Center website. On Saturday, I posted a notice about the programs that we would have at the Virtual Center this week. And then yesterday, last evening, I posted a specific piece of historical information, a paragraph from Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Number 71, which ties pretty closely, directly into what we've been doing here over the last couple of weeks with Federalist Number 10. And basically what I was trying to do is give readers of Facebook an idea of what we do, what the Virtual Center is like, what we are attempting to do, and a look at some of the experiences and exercises that we take in. In fact, I took the liberty just before we went on the air today of printing off a copy of what I did put on Facebook last evening. And basically, again, I'm talking for the most part, I presume, to people who may not be regular listeners of the Virtual Center. And so this was the approach that I used. I said, when you think about it, we here in America have the only political system in the world that people can't seem to figure out. In fact, hundreds, and I would venture, I'd wager thousands over the years, continue to fail classes in American government because they can't figure out how the whole thing works. Here's an example of the confusion that creates such problems for many of us. In Federalist Number 71, Hamilton writes about what he calls the deliberate sense of the community. And here's the paragraph in question. Quote, "The Republican principle demands," Hamilton said, "that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those to whom they entrust the government of their affairs. But it does not require an unqualified compliance, in other words, to every sudden breeze of passion or to every transient impulse which the people may receive from the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests," unquote. And so I just closed the piece by saying the sense of community should control government, Hamilton says, but not always. Somehow, when the people get caught up in what he calls a sudden breeze of passion, community sense no longer applies. And then I raise a serious question about that. How does that work? Who decides when that's the case? Is America's infatuation with Donald Trump an example of the transient impulse that so worries Hamilton? And that's really the gist of what I posted on Facebook last evening. And again, the whole point is to try to give folks an idea of what we're trying to do here at the Virtual Center. I think it's extremely important. And I think those of you who tune in regularly, I appreciate that so much. But in effect, what you are saying to me by your continued support is that you continue to validate what we're trying to do here. And I appreciate it so much because, you know, I think it's pretty obvious that I feel very, very passionately about this. And again, you know, there are a couple of things, just while I have it in my hand, there are a couple of things about that paragraph of Hamilton. I mean, you can, I don't want to spend the entire program on this because I do want to get back into Federalist Number 10. But there's several things in there that it seemed to me extremely important. And of course, the most obvious one is how do we know, or who decides when what the community seems to be saying is a so-called sudden breeze of passion or a transient impulse, which the people receive from the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests. And of course, that's the issue. In other words, how do we separate, how do we distinguish between the serious general will of the community, which, as we all, I think, agree, should really guide what government does. The best interests of the community, the public interest, so to speak. But at the same time, Hamilton reserves the right to reject that sense of community when he or when those in power decide that it's a whim, that it's a sudden impulse, that it's a sudden breeze of passion or a transient impulse. And I think the reason I mentioned Donald Trump is because I think as people continue to talk about the phenomenon of Donald Trump, it's very clear that a lot of people are tuning in, are responding to what he's saying and the way he's saying it. And I think that's very significant. So the question is this the sense of the community telling us that something's really wrong in the society? Or has Trump merely found a very successful way to touch the right chord or the right nerve, so to speak, in order to reach the public sense of concern that may exist in the country today? For a long time, I mean, the pundits continue to refer to the Trump candidacy campaign, as it were, as a phenomenon. But the longer it goes on and the stronger his poll numbers seem to get, now we're beginning to hear many of these same pundits beginning to take that campaign, that Trump initiative, a little bit more seriously and saying, you know, he could win, at least the latest polls, he could win New Hampshire, he could win Iowa. And so then the question is, is this idea of a sudden transient impulse something that we initially thought would just kind of was a flash in the pan and would disappear? And are people now beginning to take it a little bit more seriously? And then the question is, if they are, then in effect, is the sense of the community in expressing its support for what the things that Donald Trump is saying and the way he's saying it, is that an indication of the genuine sense of the community? And if it is, how do we respond to it? I mean, is merely supporting Donald Trump enough? Because if indeed Donald Trump is just a political operator, as you will, or engaged in some sort of demagoguery, then basically this is in the context of a sudden breeze, a so-called sudden breeze of passion, to use Hamilton's words. And then the other thing I think in here that is very significant are the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests. And I think there's a very, very important assumption that seems to underlie that particular statement at the very end of that paragraph. Hamilton seems to be assuming here that the interest of the community may be consistent with what the people claim they want. But he's also acknowledging that it may not. In other words, when Hamilton talks about, in 71, when he talks about the arts of men who flatter their prejudices to betray their interests, the implication here is that their interest, their real interest, the public interest, if you will, is different than what these artful candidates are saying. And so we are left with a bit of a challenge, or a bit of a problem, it seems to me. Because if indeed Hamilton is on track, and if we can see a similar kind of thing in Madison, who really drafted the first draft of the Constitution in the Virginia plan, if we continue to see that same theme here, then what we're in effect seeing is a validation of what Rousseau called the general will. The idea that there is a public interest, a right thing to do, that is, in effect, the interest of the community. But we're also acknowledging that people's political rhetoric, people's ability to demagogue and to persuade people to support things that may be consistent with their interests, but may not. That in effect, the will of the community as it's being expressed at a particular point in time, Hamilton is suggesting, may not be consistent with the public interest. So the question then is, how in the name of heaven do we find out what that public interest is, if it's an absolute, if there is a best thing for the entire community? How do we find it? More specifically, who defines it? Is it only certain people that have the right to define the public interest? Is it indeed true that the people of the community themselves are less capable of defining their own public interests than other people who claim the right to do that? It seems to me that we're into some really deep issues and concerns here. I just think these are fascinating questions. But the most important point, and going back to the Facebook page itself, for example, the key here is to give people some idea of what we're trying to do. We are trying to basically create situations where people are required to think their way through contradictions and challenges and inconsistencies, if you will. From the perspective of education itself, critical thinking, the development of cognitive skills, analysis, and these kinds of things are very, very important. I was just reading a very short piece. I didn't print it off, so I'm going to have to share this with you by memory. But a couple of hours ago, I was reading a piece about some of the latest research on the way the brain operates and the human brain. And, you know, obviously technology has reached the point now where this particular piece was talking about MRIs of the brain. We know, for example, that Boston University is conducting studies on the brains of football players who have had severe brain injuries and concussions and those kinds of things. And the issue that has come up most recently is the brain of Junior Seau, who was just recently voted into the National Football League Hall of Fame, posthumously, of course. And his daughter was there, and she was allowed to speak in Canton, Ohio. This was, I think, a week ago Sunday. But the only point that I'm making, and I think this is really significant, is that these MRIs on the brain have already indicated that good readers show in MRIs most of the brain activity in the back of their brain, whereas poor readers seem to reveal most of the brain activity in the frontal portion of their brains. And of course, the back part of the brain is where the analysis and the critical thinking and the cognitive development and all of these other things come from. The frontal part of the brain, these MRIs continue to show, is where young kids who are first learning to read by sounding out syllables and sounding out vowels and things, most of the activities in their brain are at the front. That they haven't reached the point yet where they can be asked to go deeper. Their number one, their priority at this point is just recognizing signs and sounds and being able to put words together and learning to read. But the most interesting thing is that MRIs of poor readers who are adults indicate that their brain activity remains very similar to what it was when they were first learning to read as youngsters. And so the question is, what has to happen to drive that activity from the front part of the brain to the back part of the brain? Of course, the implication here is that it's not physical, it's not a physical limitation. The implication here is that many of these people who read at an elementary level and continue to read at that level have never been asked or forced or required or encouraged or whatever the proper word is to go beyond the superficial, the initial stage of learning. That, it seems to me, is the key. And that's what we're doing here. It's one thing to read that paragraph written by Hamilton and understand what the words say. But it's quite another to take on the ideas that those words express, the ideas of Hamilton, take them on and begin to reflect on them in terms of what they say and what they mean and what their implications is and what the assumptions that drive them is and all of these other questions. It seems to me that's what we're about here, not only at the Virtual Center, but I think that's what conversation here at the Head-On Radio Network in toto is all about. It's a level of thinking and analysis and understanding that more and more people need to experience. It's where the excitement of learning happens. It is, in a nutshell, what several of the founders were referring to when they talked about the fact that education can set man free. Education can set man free when the brain activity moves from the front of the brain to the back of the brain. And I guess that's what we're about here, at least that's what I hope we are here at the Virtual Center. So again, we would love to hear from you. We'll be going back into Madison's Federalist number 10. We reached, if you recall, last Wednesday at the end of our programming for the week, we reached what I believe is effectively the midpoint of Madison's Federalist number 10 document. We stopped at a very, very convenient place, and I think we'll be picking it up. So again, before we begin that, let me once again share with you our phone number and encourage you to give others an opportunity to share in your thinking. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. Let's go back to Federalist number 10. And recognizing that that's the whole point of this Facebook entry last evening was to put Hamilton's paragraph out there to indicate what kinds of things we did here at the Virtual Center, or we're trying to do. But again, the promise of the piece itself was that in this week's programming, we would be moving into and completing Madison's Federalist number 10 document. I've gotten some looks of disbelief when I've told people that we have spent 2 full weeks on Madison's Federalist 10 and we're only halfway through it. And people look at me like, what in heaven's name are you doing with it? And I really believe that it's so heavy. It's so rich in substance and content and meaning and significance. And I just hope that we've been able to reveal some of that here in what we've done with Federalist number 10. You'll recall, and this is just very, very quick background that gets us to where we are. You'll recall that Madison's Federalist number 10 opened with a concern about what he called the violence of faction and the necessity to break and control the violence of faction. And his concern that throughout history, popular governments have always failed because of their tendency toward what he calls this dangerous vice, violent factionalism. And then he defines faction as either being a minority or a majority of the whole. It's not the size of the operation that makes it a faction. It's the commonality of the interests of those who belong to it. In other words, it is man's self-interest that drives him to join, to become a member of a faction, to find other people who think and want the same things that you do. And what this reveals is what Madison calls the link between man's freedom and his reason. As long as, Madison said, as long as man has reason, as long as man can calculate and figure out and analyze, and as long as he is free to exercise it, then man will naturally create a connection between his, what Madison calls his self-love, his self-interest, and his ability to unite with other people to get what he wants. And we looked at some of the, not only the substance of Federalist number 10, but we looked at other sentences and paragraphs that Madison and Hamilton both have written, and David Hume, if you remember, in which they talked about the degree to which people acting alone tend to be a little bit different than people acting in groups. Once you actively join or belong to a faction, you have already made the decision that your self-interest comes first. And Hamilton, Madison, and David Hume, all of these folks, agreed that there is a sense of goodness, there is an innate ability within man to determine right from wrong. And man is not necessarily inclined to always choose wrong. But the reality is, man is much more likely to go for what's right, for what his conscience tells him when he's alone. But when he becomes involved with others who want the same things, when he becomes a member of a faction, his self-interest has taken over. He has made the decision to ignore or forego what's right in favor of what he wants. And he has also calculated that if I organize or unite with other people who want the same thing, I have a much better chance of getting it. This, says Madison, is the violence of faction. It's not the size of the faction. It's the fact that it's all driven by a common interest or passion. And by definition, Madison says, because it is self-interest, it's contrary to the best interests of the community at large. In other words, by choosing self-interest, you have, in effect, decided not to support the public interest. And that's why factions are violent, factions are dangerous, Madison said, and that's why we have to do something about them, because man's tendency toward faction has been the disease which has rendered popular government a disaster throughout history. So that's really the issue. And then you'll recall, Madison said, there are two ways we can go about this business of controlling and breaking the violence of faction. We can either eliminate the causes of factions, or we can control the effects. And then he takes on eliminating the causes. And he said there are two ways to eliminate the causes of factions. One is to take away people's freedom. The other is to make everybody the same. In the first case of taking away freedom, you make it illegal or impossible for people to link up with others. By taking away their freedom, you take away their ability to act according to their reason, to their common sense. And Madison said that doing that's worse than the disease. In other words, whatever we do, we can't violate individual freedom. And then Madison, at some length, explains why it's impossible to make everybody the same, to eliminate factions by giving everybody the same interests and the same passions, so that there's no reason or need to go out and link up with other people with the same interests, since everybody has the same interests. And then he proceeds to point out that that's really impossible. And he reached the point where he was forced to say that the latent causes of faction are thus sown in the nature of man. Man's nature leads him to join factions. And we spent quite a bit of time in our last couple of programs focusing on this, because that doesn't necessarily mean that man will always choose evil. Because Madison and Hamilton and David Hume all subscribe to the idea that it's faction that is the enemy here, not self-interest. When man is alone, and man is making decisions based on what he knows to be right and wrong, it's entirely likely that man will do what's right. And they make a very good case, it seems to me, for the fact that right and goodness and a sense of justice and all of those things that are positives, that are pluses, are always on the table and at least possible, if not likely, when man is alone. But the minute man links up with other people who want the same thing, his reason takes over. His sense of right and wrong and his innate conscience is driven further and further into the background. And it's that faction issue that Madison focuses on. So Madison is not, when he says that the causes of faction, the latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man, that doesn't mean he subscribes to the Thomas Hobbes idea that man is innately evil and will always do what is bad. I've heard, going back to the Christian idea of original sin, for example, I've heard a number of people raise the question and say, and ask, can an atheist have a conscience? Can someone who believes in God not choose good over evil? The implication is, in religion, that original sin forever stains man so that he will always do what is bad. I guess one would have to accept the fact that what Madison is saying here is that's not necessarily true. Man isn't totally evil and always inclined to do what's good. But when he gets into a group of people with the same interest, that creates a totally different ballgame. Let me share with you just a couple of lines, which I think makes this point. David Hume, for example, makes that point about man alone versus man in groups. He says this: a man reads a book or pamphlet alone and coolly. There is none present from whom he can catch the passion of contagion, unquote. Man reads a book by himself. He reads it coolly. He reads it analytically. And he makes decisions in the same way. There's none present from whom he can catch the passion of contagion. When others are around who believe the same thing, let's get together, let's organize. Let's go out and find other people. Let's make our interest group bigger and more powerful. Once that catches on, then the coolness of the way that the individual reads a book is gone. And suddenly, man's passion for his own self-interest takes over. And Hamilton and Madison say pretty much the same thing. Madison in Federalist number 63, for example. As the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought in all governments. Notice Hamilton used in 71 the same expression about the deliberate sense of the community. Madison calls it the cool and deliberate sense of the community in number 63. As the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought in all governments, and actually will in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers. So there are particular moments in public affairs, Madison says, when the people, stimulated by some irregular passion, or some illicit advantage, or misled by the artful representations of interested men, may call for measures which they themselves will afterwards be the most ready to lament and condemn. He is saying exactly the same thing that Hamilton says in number 71. That man becomes susceptible to the artful arguments and rhetoric of other people whose principal agenda is self-interest. And man can get caught up in that. And he does things and supports things as a member of a group which he not only wouldn't do alone, but as Madison said, he finds himself in measures which will afterwards he'll be the most ready to lament and condemn. In other words, why did I do that? How did I do that? How could I do that? And of course, what Madison is implying here is the same thing that Hamilton is. And that is when that's the sense of the community that government is hearing, government has a responsibility to not respond to that, but to recognize, in effect, that the public interest is something quite different than what these people are asking for. So that's really the issue. And so basically, Madison concludes that it is not possible to eliminate the causes of faction. He said the inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is only to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. If we can't eliminate the causes of factions, then somehow we have got to control their effects. We've got to make it so that factions do not ever gain access to power. And of course, at this point, we are forced to confront Madison's definition of faction as either being a majority or a minority of the whole. Because realistically, when the faction in question is the majority of the people, then what Hamilton and Madison are both saying is that government can't afford to respond even to the majority when the majority is wrong, when the majority is the victim of what Hamilton called some sudden breeze of passion or transient impulse, or the recipient or the prisoner of some self-interested, artful person who has successfully persuaded you to want something that's not in society's best interests at all. Madison then, therefore, after he has made the statement that we can't eliminate the causes, we got to control the effects, Madison goes back, and he has to his distinction between minority factions and majority factions. And he says, if a faction consists of less than a majority, and of course less than a majority is a minority. And let me remind you that Madison has said a major cause of factions is the unequal distribution of property. He has used that example as the principal cause of factions throughout history. And so Madison is now talking about a faction consisting of less than a majority. He's talking about the minority faction. And of course what that means is in the context of those with or without property, the minority is always the wealthy. And the majority is always the poor. It's important to be able to make that connection. Because if you can't figure out Madison. Notice also that Madison doesn't say if a faction consists of a minority. He said if a faction consists of less than a majority. Now, why he would say it that way? Does it just sound better? Is it fancier rhetoric? Or is there something to be gained by writing in this way? For the poor reader, the one that we just talked about as reading with most of the action in the front part of the brain rather than the back part of the brain, chances are that less than a majority is not even going to attract any attention. Only those functioning from the back end of the brain are going to realize here that what Madison is telling us is that the minority faction is not the problem. Because that's what he's going to say. Let's look exactly at the way he says it. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views by regular vote. Translation? The minority faction is not our major problem, Madison is saying, because if the violence of faction is in the minority, the majority will always outvote it. So what he's saying in our political situation then, the minority is not the problem. And again, keeping in mind that when he talks minority here, in the context of property, he's talking about the wealthy, the property owners. He acknowledges that a minority faction, it may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the form of the Constitution. In other words, it could create all sorts of problems for us. It could be a real pain in the butt. But ultimately, the majority will bury it. So therefore, it's not the minority faction that causes the destruction of popular governments. Consequently, then, it must be the majority faction. It must be the organized political action of the poor. Madison says, when a majority is included in a faction, the form of popular government, on the other hand, enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. Period. What is Madison saying here? Well, he's saying a number of things. But the things that jumps out at me is that what the majority wants, Madison is saying, is not the public good. The self-interest of the majority is not the public interest, because it is self-interest. Therefore, we must make sure that the majority of the people never have the opportunity to exercise their will, their control over government. And notice the way he says it. If the majority is allowed to organize in pursuit of its own self-interest, and what is the self-interest of the poor? It's access to wealth. Money, property, opportunity, success, position, influence, clout, all the things that go with wealth. That's the self-interest that the majority always has in common. And the way Madison explains that self-interest, he said that when a majority is included in a faction, this enables it to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. If the majority is allowed to exercise its self-interest, the rights of the minority, those with property, suffer. Also, the public good suffers. What that means then, and I'm creating meaning here, what that seems to mean to me then is that the public interest in Madison's thinking, in Madison's mind, the public interest is different than the majority interest. But likely it is consistent with the minority interest. By linking the public good and the rights of the minority, the propertied, Madison is in effect saying that the property rights of the minority is the public interest. And then the next sentence, when I was teaching college classes over the years, I used to focus on this sentence and suggest that it was probably one of the major sentences in the entire document. But as you know, I've said that about 3 or 4 other sentences, so I think you probably have to take that with a grain of salt. But let's listen to the next sentence, and then we'll know whereof we speak. Madison has just said, when a majority is included in a faction, it is able to sacrifice to its ruling passion or interest both the public good and the rights of other citizens. To secure the public good and private rights against the danger of such a faction, and at the same time to preserve the spirit and the form of popular government, is then the great object to which our inquiries are directed. Our job here with the Constitution of the United States is to secure the public good and private rights against the threat of majority, and somehow do it in a way which does not violate the spirit and the form of popular government. We have to preserve republicanism. We have to preserve participatory democracy. We have to preserve a government in which the people participate. That's the tradition. That's what Madison has called in others of the Federalist Papers the genius of the American people, is their commitment to participatory government. Going all the way back to the Puritans, when they came over here in the early 1600s, and they participated in the rules under which they would be governed. The Mayflower Compact, for example. The whole idea of contractual government in which the people to be governed enter into the contract. That's the tradition from the very beginning in the development of this nation. Madison says we cannot violate that tradition. What we must do, then, is preserve popular government, but at the same time, we must make it impossible for the majority to define the public interest. Because the public interest that they would define is their private interest. And since they are the majority, the system itself enables them to exercise their will. If they are going to be participants, then by definition, as participants, we are giving them the right to exercise their private interest. We can't do that. We have to make that impossible, while at the same time we protect their right to participate. What a hell of a challenge, it seems to me. Think about this. What a fantastic challenge that Madison and these others at the convention faced in constructing a form of government that would preserve participation, preserve the spirit and the form of republicanism, but somehow make it impossible for the majority to ever organize and seize power. Because if that happens, the rights of the minority are in jeopardy. The public good is in jeopardy. And again, how closely you equate the property rights of the minority and the public good is kind of your call. I don't want to overemphasize that, because if you think they are the same, then you naturally fall into the camp of the Beardians, who basically believe that the entire Constitution was written in such a way that the protection of the property, the protection of the wealthy, is the first order of business. It is indeed possible to interpret this whole process that way. It's not entirely wrong. But it seems to me once you get into that camp, and once you close off all the other options, then you become a pretty devout supporter of the idea of plutocracy as being the intent of our political system. And of course, there are a lot of people who have taken on the challenge of convincing us that that's true. There are books after books after books that try to do that. Just as there are books upon books of people who argue against it. But it seems to me, right here in Federalist number 10, in the words of James Madison himself, it seems to me this is the key point at which how you stand on this particular issue is to be determined. Namely, how closely you equate the rights of the minority with the public interest. There's no question that in Madison's mind they are connected. But there's a difference between them being connected and the idea that the entire document and all the efforts to get it ratified is driven by that agenda alone. Again, this is difficult when you get into the schools. This is difficult stuff to teach when you raise these kinds of questions. But I guess I have to believe that young people are not as innocent and as gullible and as naive as we think they are. And I think for the most part they would appreciate being brought into these kinds of real-world substantive analysis instead of the pablum that too often most of us were exposed to in school, which dealt with this by not dealing with it at all. And of course, part of the reason that not only was it politically not possible to deal with it, but the fact of the matter is there aren't that many of our teachers who would ever even be able to get to the point of being able to do justice to these kinds of issues. That's one of the issues, it seems to me, that we have to really begin to do something about. We've got to educate our teachers to really understand what the issues are and recognize that as professional educators, as professionals, as well-educated thinking adults whose profession is to encourage education, thinking, independent thinking, and development in our young people, these people have the skills and the training to figure out how to do this in ways that can make it work and not jeopardize the future of the nation in the process. I guess what I have to say is there are too many people politically who are unwilling to take that risk. So now, it seems to me, Madison has laid out the challenge. What we have to do is we have to find a way to protect the interests of the minorities, to protect the public good from the dangers of majority faction, and somehow find a way to do it which does not violate the spirit and the form of popular government. That's the challenge. And Madison's very next line, by what means is this object attainable? Translation, how in the name of God do we do this? That, I would suggest to you, is our second hour of today's program here at the Virtual Center. We have reached the top of the hour. It is 2 p.m. in the East. I want to thank you for being with us for this hour, and I invite you to stay tuned for our second hour. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and I know Bob Kincaid has selected some music for your listening pleasure, and I think what it does is give you an opportunity to go get something to drink or to go to the restroom or whatever, in fact, you might do, and maybe take a few moments to think about where we are and where Madison might be going to take us next as he sets out to address this problem. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then after that, we'll be right back. Please stay with us.
Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Thank you for the music. It was delightful, and I'm glad you let it finish. It was great. Thank you, and thank you, those of you who have been with us through our first hour and have stayed with us for this into our second hour. For those of you who might just be joining us, welcome to today's program. We are into Federalist number 10, for those of you who might not know, and we are reaching what I think is a most critical point of the document. How to fix the problem. We spent most of our time thus far laying out exactly how Madison defines the problem. Now we're going to look at the way Madison proposes that we fix that problem. We have a phone number. We would love to hear from you and your thoughts on this stuff. This stuff is so susceptible, it seems to me, to conversation. And, you know, there's absolutely no question that true learning, true knowledge, it seems to me, is the process of interaction, communication, conversation, dialogue, deliberation, analysis, questioning, or whatever you want to call it. It really does take two people to tango. One person may do a great job, but it ain't no tango. And so we have a phone line, and we would love to hear from you. And hear your thoughts on some of these issues. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you for whatever reason are a little bit reluctant to get on the air, and instead you would like to share your thoughts with me in an email, I would love to hear from you, and I promise you that I will respond if you indeed do this. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And again, I do remind you of our Facebook page. Just go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will gain access to the page. And for those of you who were with us in the first hour, we opened the program today by sharing with you a posting that I put on the Virtual Center page last evening, which cited a paragraph from Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Paper number 71 on this whole issue of government reserving the right, while it endeavors to govern in consistency with the community interest. Government preserves the right to not do that when the community interest is the product of what Hamilton called a transient impulse or a passing breeze of passion, sudden breeze of passion. So again, you can go to our Facebook page, and we would love to hear from you. I try to do frequent postings on it. I received a notice this morning that last week I had posted 3 different entries on the Facebook page, and I encourage you, invite you to go to the page and avail yourself of the opportunity to like it. I mean, that's what Facebook is about, obviously, is to build the numbers of people that like a particular point of view. But liking it doesn't really say a whole lot. And so if you have an opportunity to comment, as many of you have, then I would invite you to do that as well. We are into Madison's Federalist number 10, and as at the very top of the hour, we ended our last hour with Madison's explanation that the job, the challenge of the Constitution of the United States, if you will, is to find a way to deal with the majority faction in such a way that it can never organize and gain power, yet at the same time to do it in a way which preserves the spirit and the form of popular government. In other words, preserves the Republican commitment, the Republican heritage, which really defines the political legacy of this nation. That's the challenge. And so in the very next paragraph, Madison raises the obvious question. By what means is this object attainable? How do we do this? And Madison goes back to this very familiar approach of pointing out options. How do we do this? He said, evidently by one of two ways. Either the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. Very important sentence. So Madison says there's two ways we can go about this. The first way is to somehow prevent the existence of the same passion or interest in a majority at the same time. And I think he's kind of, in a way, he's kind of dealt with some of this already, and he's kind of suggested that this isn't really going to be too possible. The second option, the second way to deal with this, is if there is a majority with the same passion or interest, to somehow render it, by their number and local situation, unable to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If there is a majority, somehow we have to make sure that it can't organize. And notice, when it does organize, when the majority faction is able to exert its will, Madison refers to that as a scheme of oppression, because the self-interest of the majority is going to be satisfied at the expense of the private interests, private rights of the minority. So by definition, then, Madison calls majority rule, driven by self-interest, oppression. Okay. So Madison goes on. If the impulse and the opportunity be suffered to coincide, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. This, when Madison says we well know, this is an issue that he has addressed before. When you are a member of a faction, your ability to do right disappears. And you become obsessed with the satisfaction of your own self-interest, along with those who are part of your group. So now Madison is repeating that very same thing. He said, if the impulse and the opportunity are allowed to coincide, if people can connect their self-interest to an opportunity to be successful, He said, we well know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as an adequate control. Once that happens, then religion won't work to control human behavior. Morality won't either. In other words, all of these things are lost. All the good things, the possibility of good outcomes, are lost when faction materializes. He said they are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals. Now remember, he's talking about moral and religious checks on behavior. And he says they are not found to be such on the injustice and violence of individuals. In other words, we know that morality, what's right, and religion have not worked to check the behavior of individuals. And we also know that these lose their efficacy in proportion to the number combined together. That is, in proportion as their efficacy becomes needful. So we know that religion and morality are unsuccessful, insufficient checks on self-interest, even when individuals are alone. And we know that that decreases even more as they become members of a faction. And as the faction becomes bigger and bigger, morality and religion are even less able to affect or check human behavior. Madison says, from this view of the subject, it may be concluded that pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of factions. Majority rule democracy is not a solution to our problem, it is our problem. A common passion or interest will in almost any case, every case, Madison says, be felt by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert result from the form of government itself, and there is nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Once the majority organizes, there's no way to control it. And I haven't said this, it's in the background, but I sometimes believe that it's probably better to say it, at least to remind people of this. All of this that Madison's talking about here is his read on what is going on under the Confederation when the state legislatures are in the driver's seat, are the most powerful under the state constitutions drafted at the time of independence. The absence of a national government over the states has allowed, under the Confederation, legislatures that fall under the control of majority factions to pass the kind of legislation that Madison believes will sink this republic if we don't do something to fix it. Paper money laws, installment laws, stay laws, making it legal for people to pay their debts in goods and materials and products rather than money. All of these things which violate private contract or violate obligations to the state are examples of what happens when government falls under the control of a majority faction. So all of this analysis that Madison is doing here is his read on what's going on under the Confederation and why the Confederation had to be changed. Okay, so what he's saying is that pure democracy, majority rule, can't solve the problem. It is the problem. Because if the majority is allowed to exist, then a common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by the majority of the whole, by a majority of the whole. A communication and concert, in other words, the ability to organize, will result from the form of government itself, and there's nothing to check the inducements to sacrifice the weaker party or an obnoxious individual. Once the majority exists under participatory government, under republicanism, the majority rules the day. And as we know, under the Confederation, the powers of the governors were insignificant. There were no independent courts. So in a sense, state governments were controlled by legislatures. And if you reach the point where state legislatures were susceptible to being given instructions by the majority of their constituents, then legislators had no option except to carry out the will of the majority. So what Madison is saying, somehow we've got to eliminate that majority. We can't eliminate the causes that creates the majority. What we have to do is find a way to make it so that even if there is one, it can't organize. It can't exist. It can't function. Hence it is, Madison is going into some history here. And he says, hence it is that such democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Here's the reason that popular governments throughout history have never been able to make it. Right here. This is it. And for those, and I don't know that we spent specific time on this, but you may recall, I hope I mentioned this, that when Madison was preparing for the Constitutional Convention, once it was called, he asked Jefferson, who was in France, to send him every book on the subject of governments, of republics, that he could lay his hands on. And Jefferson shipped cases of books over to Madison, and Madison goes through an analysis through the winter of 86 and 87. Madison goes through books on how previous republics were set up, how they were supposed to function, what went wrong, why they didn't work. So when Madison puts his document together in early 87, his Vices of the Political System, which he writes in April of 87, lays out what he's learned from looking at all these other examples of failed republics. And from that, he lays out the Virginia Plan and takes that to the convention when it begins in May of 1787. And finally, he closes his paragraph by talking about idealists. He calls them theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government, have erroneously supposed that by reducing mankind to a perfect equality of their political rights, they would at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. In other words, Madison is saying dreamers in the past who have supported popular government have believed that if you give people political equality, then equality in all the other things that contribute to factions will automatically happen. But as he says, these were erroneous beliefs of idealists. Can't happen. Madison has reached the point now where he's about to lay out his solution to the challenge. He says a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the efficacy which it must derive from the Union. Once we understand, Madison is saying, the nature of a republic, we can begin to see how it will solve both parts of our problem. It will do two things. It will preserve popular government by letting people choose those who will represent them. But at the same time, because the power of the people is transferred from them to the person they elect, their delegate, their representative, then you have preserved participation, but you've taken power out of the hands of the people and given it to the representative. Madison is now going to go through and explain exactly how this will work. I would, as a preface, let me say that not only for me is this the most challenging part of Federalist Number 10. For me, it's the newest read, if you will, the newest exposure that I've had in a long time to Madison. Throughout much of my career, I supported the progressive idea articulated by Charles Beard and the others, Vernon Parrington and the others, that this was a government set up by the few for the few. And the more carefully I've been reading the Federalist Papers as a result of our time here together at the Virtual Center, the more I've had to wrestle with the depth of the thought of the founders. And the result of that is that I have begun to see much more in the way they defined the problem and laid out the solution than I ever had before. I guess I was one of those who fell for the obvious. It seemed so neat. It seemed so simple. But at the same time, it insulted the intelligence of Madison and Hamilton and the others. And I realized that. I kept saying, they're deeper than this. It can't be that simple. But the fact of the matter is, the way they were writing the Federalist Papers to appeal to one group of people and intentionally not be understandable to the rest seemed to support the position that I was taking. This is the first time in my career, in my life, that I'm going to be taking a position on Federalist Number 10, which I believe is much more supportable and much more likely to have been Madison's solution. I believe that I've been a little bit unfair over the years to Madison and Hamilton and the others. And I think it's time that I began to give them their due. But again, my position here at the Virtual Center is not to tell you what to believe, or not even try to tell you what to believe, but to try to lay out the information as I've got it, as I understand it, and leave the decisions to you. The mere fact that you are tuned into this program, those of you who regularly listen to this program and to the Head On Radio Network generally, are obviously thinking, critically, analytical people. And what I'm doing basically is playing to your strength. And I'm saying if I lay out this interpretation and I can do it in a way which makes some sense, then thinking, intelligent people can take this analysis and hopefully can effectively digest it and criticize it where it needs criticism. And if it's not right, and if there are flaws in it, then I trust that you will get back to me and let me know. And indeed, if there's substance to what you're saying, then I will go back to the drawing board and I will continue to seek the truth as I can best understand it. Anyway, Madison has basically said the solution to our problem lies not in pure democracy, but in a republic, for two reasons. The two great points of difference, he says, between a democracy and a republic are, first, the delegation of the government in the latter to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens and greater sphere of country over which the latter may be extended. And again, when Madison frequently uses the former and the latter, by definition, he is speaking to people who read well. People who read at the elementary level are not going to pick up on this issue of former and latter. It's the more analytical, cognitive people who are going to say, wait a minute, the latter, he goes back, which does he mean? And so basically when he says the latter, he's talking about republics as opposed to democracies. So he said the difference between a democracy and a republic, and then he makes specific reference back to them. The former is democracy. The latter is republic. And so basically the two differences between republic and democracy are, first, the delegation of the government in the republic, in the latter, to a small number of citizens. Delegation of government means transfer of power from the people to their representative. They can still participate. They vote for the representative. But in the process, the people are giving the representative the authority to make decisions in their name. And the whole implication of the so-called social contract in our election system is that whether you voted for this representative or not, by voting, you have consented to be governed by the result. In other words, what the representative decides, you have an obligation to go along with because it's the law. And the only option you have, if you don't like it, is to work within the system and try to get the law changed. So the transfer of power from the voter to the elected representatives is one advantage of a republic over democracy. The second advantage is the larger sphere of country over which a republic can govern as opposed to a democracy. And this takes us back to Montesquieu's idea of republicanism the only way that Republican government can work, Montesquieu argued, was that it needed to be small. Because the republic, the representative, the elected representative in the ideal republic was to carry out the will of the voters, the will of those who voted for him. And the only way that you could ensure an intricate relationship between elected representative and voters in the ideal republic, Montesquieu said, was to keep it small. So the voters would know the representative and the representative would know the needs and wants of the voters. And that meant that by a close interactive relationship between voters and elected representatives, the people could hold the representative accountable. And when election time rolled around, if the representative voted other than what the will of the people suggested, then the people would have the opportunity to fire that elected representative and elect somebody new who would follow the will of the constituency, of the community. Now Madison is talking about a republic that's going to extend over a much larger area. So in effect, he is changing the definition of republic here. In the process, he's changing the location of power. Because in the small republic of Montesquieu, if the people can instruct the delegate, the representative, and tell him how to vote, and hold the representative accountable if he doesn't vote that way by replacing him, then in effect power remains within the people. But if the representative represents a lot more people in a lot wider area, then it becomes less possible for the constituents to instruct their representative. Because the constituents are spread out over such a wide area that it's unlikely that they'll be able to get together and agree on what the representative should do. So consequently, if the local circumstances under which the constituency, the electorate, finds itself, and it's impossible to come together and put together instructions for the representative, then the representative, in effect, becomes the decision maker. If there's no instructions coming from the voters, then the representative is free to make the decisions. And that's the delegation of government that Madison is talking about, from the people to the elected representative. Now he's going to go through and explain how each of these will work to the benefit of popular government and the ability to control the effects of factions. And controlling the effects of factions means that the factions cannot have any effect. That's what Madison means. The effect of the first difference, which is the delegation of government in a republic to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. The effect of this first difference, Madison says, on the one hand, is, quote, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice pronounced by the representatives of the people will be more consonant to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves convened for the purpose. Period. Those two sentences are going to form the basis not only for the balance of our program today. We have, right now, it's 40 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 17 or 18 minutes left in our program today. And we'll be back tomorrow. I remind you that tomorrow's program begins at 1:30, 1/2 hour later than today's, as we usually do on Tuesdays. But what I'm suggesting is that this particular passage is probably going to be the basis for our conversation for the rest of today and the bulk of tomorrow. This, it seems to me, is the most controversial substantive part of Federalist Number 10. This, for me, is the new stuff. This, for me, is the part that I tended to pass over too lightly. Let me explain what I did by reading it again. The effect of the first difference, he says, on the one hand, is to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interest of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations. And traditionally, the way I read this was, who the hell are these people whose wisdom and love of justice and patriotism, who are they? How come they're not self-interested like everybody else? And so the conclusion that I reached was that what Madison is saying here is that it's the minority, the property owners, who are able to best define the public interest. Because the public interest is their private interest. Made perfect sense to me. And it makes that kind of sense to a lot of other people as well. In other words, what Madison seems to be saying here is, let the wealthy make the decisions. Find a way to allow the people to participate in the process in order to choose the right people whose patriotism and love of justice and wisdom will allow them to put aside their own self-interest for the public interest. And I always thought to myself, hell, he practically said before, the public interest is their private interest. So this is a very subtle way for Madison to justify turning power over from the majority to the minority. Somebody's going to make the call. Somebody's making decisions. Somebody's controlling. And my conclusion, if the majority is not controlling, then the minority is. And that has been, for all practical purposes, my interpretation of this document from up until now. It really implies duplicity and insincerity on the part of James Madison. It implies that Madison's commitment to Republican government, to the spirit and the form of popular government and all the rest of it, is insincere. And it implies as well that his principal concern are the best interest of those with the most property. And if you set up a system where they call the shots, they make the decisions, but it's a system in which everybody else can participate, then it seems to me you've solved the dual problem. You've effectively delegated the government from the people to the people they represent. And you've also guaranteed who those people are. They're the best people. And Madison says they are the best people. They are the people whose love of justice and patriotism and wisdom. And, when you ask yourself that question, then the conclusion is, who can they be except the propertied? And this seemed to be for me, the most comprehensive way of understanding Federalist Number 10. But again, it implies things about Madison. It implies things about his character. It implies a whole lot about this whole process. And there's absolutely no question that there's a lot of evidence that what it seems to imply, the negatives that it seems to imply, are in fact there. Many of the leading anti-federalists agreed that this was a sales job. The ratification of the Constitution was one of the most sophisticated, highly propagandist sales jobs in the history of the world. And in the process, Madison is redefining Republican government in a way, and in effect, Madison is saying, as long as the people can participate, it's Republican. But what you've effectively done is deny the people the power to control what government does. So I think you can pretty much understand where a lot of this has been. I want to suggest something a little bit more involved. Now, that's pretty involved. I mean, when you think about it, that's pretty heavy. But it's also somewhat simplistic. And it gives Madison credit for being shrewd and calculating, but it raises some questions about ethics and morality. And I've had a problem all the way through, because I am inclined, the more I read Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, and the rest of them, the more I'm inclined to believe that when these people discuss politics, discuss government, discuss human nature, discuss freedom and equality and all the rest of it, I have been inclined to conclude that they are far from calculating, manipulative, duplicitous people. There's too much to them. They are too well read. They are too mired in the issues of ethics and morality to be guilty of what I found myself claiming that they had done. And so as I prepared these programs for the Virtual Center, I have done more and more reading, more and more analysis. I've pondered and I've reflected and I've compared and I've contrasted, and I've isolated paragraphs and points from other Federalist papers and private letters and all the rest of it. And I think I have found the key to the nature of this republic as Madison envisioned it. And intellectually, I am so excited about it. I want to present it. It's not my own, totally. It's not totally new. What is new, however, is that it suggests ways of looking at these issues from people that for a long time I hadn't read carefully enough, or I was inclined not to totally buy into. I bought into the idea that when Madison said that latent causes of faction are sown in the nature of man, I bought into the idea that Madison was buying into the dark side of human nature that Hume talks about. And over the time, I have read enough of Madison to convince me that that's not right. That's not fair. That is not true. Madison, throughout, is consistent supporter of republicanism. He is not a fair weather friend of republicanism. He's not just mouthing words. I believe that there's enough evidence in Madison to document the fact that Madison genuinely believes that republicanism can work, provided the system is set up to function in certain ways. I believe that this, for me, new approach to Madison, which is, as I say, is not new, but it's new for me, is extremely idealistic. I don't believe it's naive. On the contrary, Madison is anything but naive. But I do believe that it's idealistic. I think in order to work, an awful lot of pieces have to fall into the right places at the right time. And in that sense, Madison may be a dreamer a little bit. But at the same time, it has convinced me that he may be naive, he may be idealistic. He may be a bit of a dreamer. But he's not the self-interested, manipulative, calculating, duplicitous Madison that I had always believed he was. It had always bothered me because I always felt that there was more to Madison than I was giving him credit for, but I couldn't figure it out. Now I think I have. I feel a lot better about Madison. I feel a lot better about myself in terms of my interpretation of Madison. I feel much more comfortable with the founders. If possible, I believe that the founders have emerged as more heroes in my mind than they ever were. I think this is one of the most brilliant political strategies to ever be conceived by the mind of man. I believe we are shortchanging our young people by denying them the opportunity to experience this view of the founders. I think that if we really went to the mat, if we really set out to understand and explain to our young people how these people believed that you could solve the problem of rampant self-interest on the one hand and freedom and the rights of the minority on the other, our young people would be so appreciative and so understanding and so supportive and so much more intelligent in the way they participated in voting and voted. And I have to keep telling myself, we have entitled these programs the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It seems to me that this is the key to a renewed sense of civic responsibility among our young people. We have got to use it. I believe in the process we will be successful in developing a sense of respect and admiration for the wisdom and the honesty and the morality and the idealism of the founders that is not there now. We are turning out ignorant cynics who have concluded that everybody's lying to them. There's no such thing as truth. Just go where my best interests are. Support who seems to me has the best chance of giving me what I want. The hell with everybody else. I think more and more that's what we're turning out. I think there is here within Madison an opportunity to turn that completely around and begin to conduct education in a way that we can be proud of, in a way that the rest of the world will be able to understand and appreciate, in a way which begins finally to bring to the founders a sense of respect and understanding and appreciation that we've denied them for a long time. With that, and we've only got about two and a half minutes left in our program today. But let me just make a couple of introductory comments on this first issue of refining and enlarging the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens. What does it mean to refine and enlarge the public view? How do you enlarge the public view? What we're talking about here is making the public view wider, less narrow, less provincial, less driven by my self-interest, by what I want. Much more appreciative of the fact that there are other people out there with wants too. In other words, when you enlarge the public view, you are encouraging people to think more broadly rather than narrowly. You are, as the expression goes, broadening the horizons of the general public. You are enhancing their sensitivity to the fact that there are other people and other interests and other needs out there besides your own. You are, in effect, providing a worldview that is more cosmopolitan, more informed, and more aware than narrow people ever would have had the chance to know without it. So what you are doing is bringing an awareness of the complexities of the world out there to people whose self-interest tells them that they need to be narrow. And you are saying, no, you don't want to be narrow. You want to be broad. You want to broaden your horizons, as it were. That's the first step here. But unfortunately, for today's program, it's the last step. It is now 59 minutes after the hour, and it's time to leave. We need to get out of here so that Rick Smith can begin his 3 o'clock program on the Head On Radio Network. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you'll be back with us tomorrow, 1/2 hour later, at the Virtual Center. Enjoy your evening. Be safe, and thank you.